Alright guys, welcome to week 23. This week we are doing personality 2. It's not really challenging, but it's got a bunch of weird stuff kind of all packed in, so it's a little challenging because there's no story, no flow to it. Anyway, so let's get started. When we ended personality 1, we started talking about traits and trait theorists, and one of the big things is looking at cross-cultural research has found the 5-factor of personality traits in a number of different cultures. So our cultures are not isolated, and we are shaped by the people who surround us. We also see a lot of trait-situation interaction, which is the assumption that a particular circumstances of any given situation will influence the way in which a trait is expressed. So essentially what that means is that depending on whatever situation we're in, it will dictate how the trait is expressed. So when we talk about personality 2, we have to talk about behavior genetics. It's a field of study where we focus on the relationship between heredity and personality. So we use twin studies in order to see the influence of personality on traits. We see a lot of connections that are similar of your 5 factors, which are passed down genetically, which is pretty cool. Now, one of the biggest challenges of one of the biggest theorists of cultural personalities is going to be Hofstede. Now, Hofstede has come up with the 4 basic dimensions: individualism and collectivism, power distance, masculinity, femininity, and uncertainty avoidance. Now, of the 4, you really need to understand individualism and collectivism, as well as power distance. Now, individualism is the ability to think for yourself and plan for yourself, and making sure that your life is fulfilled to your meaning. So when we talk about Hofstede, we talk about high or low. If you're high in individualism, you're like the United States. Where here you're working hard for school, not for your betterment of your family, but betterment for your life and your future. That's high in individualism. Collectivism is the opposite. It's when you go out of your way to provide a better life for your family. That your focus is actually your family's success, not your own success. So individualism would be United States. High in individualism is United States. High in collectivism would be China, Korea, Japan, a lot of your Asian countries. Power distance is how much control your poor or your low-powered citizens feel like they have access to power. So here in the United States, we have a low power distance, which means we here in the United States believe there's not that big of a gap between normal citizens like you and me into powerful citizens like senators and all that stuff. So when we talk about power distance, someone who is high in power distance believes that there is no way that they could, in fact, become a powerful or have access to the powerful people. India is a perfect example. If you're born poor in India, you're not going to be, there's really no way you can crawl your way out of it. It's very, very challenging. Masculinity, femininity, some cultures are masculine, some are feminine, uncertainty, avoidance, all of that. Now, when we start talking about personalities, we have personality tests, which you've probably taken some throughout your entire life. They've been online, they're in newspapers, they're in magazines and all that stuff. Now, one of a great way to measure personality is by interviews. It's a method of personality assessment in which the professional asks questions of the client and allows the client to answer either in a structured or unstructured fashion. When we do deal with interviews, we do deal with the halo effect, which is a tendency of an interviewer to allow positive characteristics of a client to influence the assessment of a client's behavior and statement. What that means is if you like someone, you're less likely to take them as seriously, or you're less likely to see them in a negative fashion after they make a really bad comment. An example of this would be celebrities, when they make a negative comment, for the most part, most people blow it off. Like, who cares, unless it's really, really offensive, typically. So, halo effect is a very negative aspect of interviews. Also, they're completely unstructured and it's completely on self-reporting. So the people can talk about anything they want to talk about, maybe not even on task. Now, when we deal with measuring personalities, we have something called the projective test. Now, projective tests are when you use projection, which is a defense mechanism placing or projecting one's own thoughts into a situation that may or may not be there. So when we have projective tests, what that is it's a personality assessment that presents ambiguous visual stimuli to the client and then asks the clients to respond with whatever comes to mind. So you're shown an image and you're asked to respond, and your responses reflect your personality. So one of the most famous one is the Rorschach ink blot test. It's a projective test that uses 10 ink blots to show ambiguous stimuli. This is used by your psychoanalyst. It's really hard to interpret. The art of interpreting the ink blot responses is an art, not quite a science, which is a big problem why a lot of people don't use it. Now, ink blots, and I have a bunch of pictures here in a second that I'll show you, are probably one of the most famous of the projective tests. The other one of the projective tests is one of my favorites, is the thematic apperception test. Now, the thematic apperception test is a projective test, of course, which means you're filling in the information in your brain into a ambiguous situation, so your personality is able to come through that way, and then your personality will be interpreted that way. Now, when we deal with projective tests, they're incredibly subjective. There's no right answer, there's no wrong answer, and there's so much things that you can see, so many different ways it can be interpreted. It's just, there's a ton of bias that could be there. It's very challenging. So the Rorschach ink blot test is one of the most famous tests, and what you do is you ask, the moment you see this image, what do you see? So I'm going to show you an image. What are you seeing right now? What's the first thing you think of when you see it? Okay, so here's just a couple of them. Like, what do you think of? What's your first thing? Explain what's happening in this picture, what you're seeing. What is this at the top? What is this at the bottom? Explain it. Those are the types of questions a psychoanalyst would ask. And keep in mind, there's 10 complete images that a psychoanalyst would go from beginning to end. They would write down your responses, and then at the end of those responses, they would sit down and analyze those responses, and then your analysis would dictate your personality of what your unconscious says, or what your unconscious plays a role in your personality. Now, the thematic apperception test, also known as the TAT, is when you look at a picture, what is the picture telling you? What are you thinking? What is happening in the story? So you're putting in your own thoughts and opinions. So when you look at this next picture, what is happening in this picture? So when you look at this, you're thinking, oh my God, she did something terrible and he's trying to get away from her, stuff like that. You're taking your own thoughts and ideas and projecting it into this picture, and you're filling it with your own thoughts and ideas. Same type of thing. What's the first thing you think of when you look at this? Same thing here. What are you seeing? This is thematic apperception. So it's ambiguous situations between two people, and you have to tell what it is. Now, other ways we look at personality is by behavioral measures. When we deal with behavioral measures, the most common one is direct observation, which is an assessment in which a professional observes the client engaged in an ordinary or day-to-day behavior to detect. Typically, if you're going to be diagnosed as ADHD or anything like that, you're typically going to have a classroom visit by a psychologist to see if you actually need it. So they're just going to sit there and watch your behavior. Now, while they're doing a direct observation, they're going to write down what you're doing and things like that. One of the ways they can do that is by a rating scale. At the end, they'll rank your behavior, whether you're on task most of the time, some of the time, none of the time, all of those types of things. And then also frequency count. How often were you on track? How often were you this? How often were you that? Depending on what they're looking for. Now, when you deal with behavior measures, keep in mind that you're dealing with observer bias. Sometimes observers will know something, sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll be looking for something, sometimes they won't. So you have all these different aspects that make it much more complicated. Now, one of the most challenging parts of this unit is personality inventories, mostly because there are so many of them and they all have abbreviations. So before you get upset that there's so many, take a breath. You're going to be okay. So what is a personality inventory? A personality inventory is the most reliable and it's standardized test used to figure out personalities. It's a paper, pencil, or computerized test that consists of statements that require specific standardized responses from a person taking the test. So, if you've ever taken a personality test, unless it was with a psychologist or psychiatrist, it was just kind of like a mock one, not a complete one. It was a personality inventory where you go through and you mark your answers. Now, we're going to go through these in much greater detail, but the big ones are NEO-PI, which is based on the 5-factor model, Ocean. Then you have the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is based on Carl Jung. And then you also have the MIPI-2, which is designed to detect abnormal personality, and that is going to be seen when we diagnose clinical personality disorders, which is pretty cool. So when we talk about these personality inventories, we see in different methods. We have interviews, which everyone uses. We have projective tests, which are used mostly by psychoanalysts. We have behavioral assessments, which are used by behavior and social cognitive therapists, as well as your personality inventories, which are done by trait theorists. All of these are done by trait theorists. Now, keep in mind, I've posted a couple of personality tests online. I've also talked about it online, and some of these you can get like a mock test. They're a good idea because they're fun to do and they're kind of insightful. They're not equal in quality, reliability, or validity. So if you think going on and taking a test that calls itself the MIPI-2 is a real test and doesn't cost you any money, it's not. So don't get too hooked. So understand that when you do it. One of the big reasons is because there's no professional interpretation of the results. It's not just, oh, here's the key. Oh, there you go. It's a lot more complicated than that. There are numerous, there's lax, it's so important I did it twice. Now, when we assess traits, we look at personality inventories. Our questionnaires, true, false, agree, disagree, rank, in order to gauge a wide range of feelings, behaviors, and standardize it, which is important. Now, the first one is the Haste model, or EPQ. Now, the EPQ is based on 2 major dimensions: extroversion, introversion, emotional stability, instability. Okay, so those are the basic foundation. Once you figure out if you're an introversion or extroversion, are you emotionally unstable or stable, you are now use this chart. So if you are introverted and unstable, like myself, you are quiet, unsociable, reserved, pessimistic, sober, rigid, anxious, and moody. Sounds like me. So the eye snake personality. Now, the Myers-Briggs is made up by Carl Jung. It's about introspective self-report questions designed to indicate psychological preferences on how people perceive the world. So it looks at how you interpret things and how you process new information. The biggest thing about the Myers-Briggs, or the MBTI, is that it looks at how your personality compares to others. What are your strengths? What are their strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are their weaknesses? Which is pretty unique. If you take an MMPI-2, MBTI, you are going to come up with responses that have 4 letters, and these 4 letters correlate to one of the 16 personalities possible. Now, the MMPI, which is the most widely researched and most clinically used of all the personality inventories, is used to identify emotional disorders. All of your severe disorders like multi-personalities, somatic personality disorder, all of those other different personality disorders are diagnosed by using the MMPI MMPI-2, which is why it's the most clinically and most researched. It is the most commonly one used in clinical settings, which means it's being used by psychiatrists and psychologists in hospitals. It's not the most widely used, it's just the most popular one amongst psychologists research. Now, the MMPI was developed by empirically testing a pool of items and selecting the discriminated groups. With your MMPI, it breaks down like this: after treatment, before treatment, are you doing better, are you doing worse, those types of things. When we look at personality inventories, there are questionnaires about how people respond. The MMPI-2 is the most widely used for clinical. It's empirically derived, which means it's all research-based, and the tests are objectively scored, which means there's no bias, there's no observer bias, there's no halo effect, there's nothing at all. It's just straight up numbers. Now, your 16PF is based on 16 scales. It looks on how you demonstrate your personality. The observer has to be able to judge expressiveness and show things like that. When you evaluate these types of things, you have to look at it as a predictor of behavior. We only look at the 16PF to figure out how you're going to behave in a certain situation. So the 16PF, it's an hour long. It's published with 2 keys, and there are 16 scales that it looks at, as I'm showing you some. You don't need to know all the scales. I'm just showing you what they are. And then we have secondary scales as well. And these are all used to compile the 16 personality frame points, which is with the 16PF. So just be familiar with it. Now, the NeoPi is another big one. The NeoPi takes ISNCS, or the EPQ, and bumps it up a little bit more. It is used to diagnose drugs, and it's the foundation is the big factor 5, which is your ocean. Openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, and extroversion are all of your components that go into it. And the NeoPi is used to diagnose drug abuse. So that's pretty cool. And then you have the Keirsey temperament sorter. Now, the Keirsey temperament sorter is one of my favorites. It is the most widely used personality inventory. Psychologists created it, and it can be used in a standardized fashion by companies like Target, Allstate, and millions of other companies use this. The reason why they use it is because it's very simple. There are 4 temperaments that can be subdivided into an artisan, guardian, rationale, and idealist. Every single person falls into one of those 4 categories after taking the test, and it makes it much easier, much more manageable of trying to understand exactly what it's saying. So when you deal with temperaments, like I said, for the Keirsey temperament sorter, you have 4 different: guardian, artisan, rational. Very, very interesting. Looking at what each means. And then finally, your last of your personality inventories is the CPI, or the California Psychological Inventory. It's created to assess the everyday aspects of our personality, mostly social expertise, how well we deal with others, maturity, achievement orientation, and creative temperament. What it is, it's really looking at our personality in regards to a social context, how well we deal with others. So as you can see, it's not a hard week, but it's a weird week. There's just a lot of abbreviations, and there's no real flow. So anyway, I hope this helps. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you in class. Have a great week, guys. Good luck.